In the early hours of a quiet Ohio morning, Natalie and John Shirilla were told their daughter had been in a serious car accident. The details were limited: a crash, severe injuries, a helicopter transport to the hospital. At that moment, they believed they were bracing for bad news. They did not yet understand they were standing at the edge of a tragedy that would permanently divide their lives into before and after. When police finally spoke to them, the words came carefully. A vehicle had crashed into a building on Progress Drive. 2 people inside the car were dead. Their daughter had been driving. Mackenzie Shirilla was alive. Her boyfriend, Dominic Russo, and their friend Davion were not. What initially sounded like a catastrophic accident immediately took on a different weight, not just because of the deaths, but because of the circumstances surrounding them. Even in the earliest moments, investigators felt something was wrong. Emergency responders arrived to a scene of total destruction. A car had slammed directly into a brick building at extreme speed. The front end was crushed beyond recognition. The impact was violent enough to kill instantly. Inside the vehicle were 3 young people. Dominic Russo, seated in the front passenger seat, was pronounced dead at the scene. Davion, seated in the back, was also pronounced dead. The driver, 17-year-old Mackenzie Shirilla, was still breathing. Body camera footage captured the confusion, urgency, and shock as officers worked to assess who could still be saved. Mackenzie was alive, badly injured, and trapped in the driver's seat. One detail stood out immediately. She was the only one wearing a seatbelt. That fact alone would later become central to the case. The wreckage sat undisturbed for nearly 45 minutes before being discovered. A passing motorcyclist noticed the destroyed vehicle around 6:15 a.m. and called emergency services. By the time help arrived, there was nothing that could be done for Dominic and Davion. At first, the explanation seemed obvious: a late night, young people, possible drug use, a medical condition known to cause fainting. Mackenzie had been diagnosed with POTS, a disorder that can lead to dizziness or loss of consciousness. Combined with reports of drug possession in the vehicle, officers initially believed this was a tragic accident. But then investigators began looking closer. There were no skid marks, no braking, no evidence of hesitation. The car had accelerated and never slowed down. That detail refused to fade into the background. Earlier that night, Mackenzie, Dominic, and Davion attended a high school party. Mackenzie was just days away from turning 18, and friends later described the night as celebratory. But not everything about her behavior felt normal. At around 2 a.m., Mackenzie was seen smoking. At one point, she reportedly offered psychedelic mushrooms to the host. Friends later said this was highly unusual. Mackenzie had never been known to casually use or distribute drugs. At 3:30 a.m., the group left the party and drove across town to another friend's house. They spent more than an hour watching television. Nothing about the moment suggested imminent danger. At approximately 5 a.m., Mackenzie said she wanted to go home. She asked to drive. Dominic usually drove. That was his role. But this time, he handed her the keys. Then came another moment that would later matter. When Davion asked for a ride home, Mackenzie refused. The refusal escalated into an argument. Dominic stepped in and convinced her to let Davion come along. All 3 got into the car. None of them knew it would be the last decision they ever made together. Security cameras later captured the vehicle turning onto Progress Drive. It was the wrong direction. Progress Drive is short. It ends abruptly, at a solid brick building. As the car entered the road, it began accelerating rapidly. Investigators would later determine the speed increased from roughly 30 miles per hour to over 90. There was no braking. In the final seconds, the vehicle swerved sharply, narrowly missing a tree. That maneuver mattered. It suggested awareness, control, a choice. Then the car continued straight, directly into the wall. The impact was devastating. Investigators struggled to understand how no one nearby had heard the crash. Businesses in the area operated overnight. Lights were on, people were present, and yet, silence. Officers documented the scene carefully, the angle of impact, the damage, the absence of braking. The crash was initially logged as an accident, but doubts lingered. At the hospital, Mackenzie's parents were told their daughter had survived, that she had been driving, that 2 people were dead, and that drugs had been found in the car. Relief and horror collided at once. Then officers visited Dominic's family. They had no idea their son had even been in an accident. They were told he was gone. For them, time stopped. Over the following weeks, Mackenzie recovered physically. She was discharged and returned home. The community mourned Dominic and Davion. Many believed Mackenzie was another victim of a terrible accident, but her behavior began to unsettle those watching closely. She did not attend the funerals. She posted openly on social media about drugs and partying. On Halloween, she attended a party dressed as a corpse. Her parents defended her publicly. Still, no charges were filed. Not yet. Everything changed when Dominic's family brought police a video found on his phone, recorded just 10 days before the crash. In it, Mackenzie can be heard threatening him, not once, repeatedly. The tone was aggressive, demanding, unrelenting. Text messages followed, messages in which Mackenzie threatened to crash a car, messages implying Dominic would never be allowed to leave. At that moment, the narrative shifted. This was no longer just an accident.
When investigators reopened the case, they did so quietly. There was no press conference, no public announcement, no declaration that the original conclusion had been wrong. But behind the scenes, everything changed. The crash was no longer being reviewed as an accident. It was now being examined as a possible double homicide. Detectives returned to the crash site with fresh eyes. They re-examined measurements, angles, and timelines. They pulled traffic camera footage again. They reconstructed the final seconds, frame by frame. The absence of braking no longer looked like a tragic oversight. It looked deliberate. Dominic's phone became the center of the investigation. Messages between him and Mackenzie painted a disturbing picture. Conversations revealed a pattern of emotional volatility, control, and escalating threats. When Dominic talked about leaving, Mackenzie's responses shifted rapidly, from desperation to anger to intimidation. Friends later told police that Dominic had confided in them. He had tried to break up with Mackenzie multiple times. Each attempt ended the same way: tears, threats, claims she could not live without him. Some threats were explicit. Others were chilling in their implication. One message stood out: a reference to crashing a car. At the time it was sent, no one thought it would become literal. Detectives began interviewing everyone in Mackenzie's orbit: friends, classmates, former partners, anyone who had spent time with her in the months leading up to the crash. What emerged was not a single dramatic revelation, but a consistent pattern: mood swings, obsession, fear of abandonment. One former boyfriend described her as unstable and emotionally intense. Another friend described her as someone who believed she could control outcomes through rituals or symbols. Others recalled moments where Mackenzie spoke about death casually, even flippantly. None of this proved murder, but together it suggested motive. When investigators obtained Mackenzie's phone data, they discovered a digital trail that raised serious alarms. Videos showed her speeding aggressively while filming herself. Snapshots recorded behind the wheel. Moments where she laughed while losing control of the vehicle. Moments where she bragged about dangerous driving. There was no sign of fear, only confidence and recklessness.
Investigators noted that this behavior didn't occur once or twice. It was repeated, habitual, almost performative. Driving fast was not something Mackenzie's avoided. It was something she seemed to enjoy. As detectives dug deeper into Mackenzie's digital life, they noticed something else: money. Photos surfaced of her posing with large sums of cash, designer clothing, expensive purchases. No job, no documented source of income. They also found fake ID. Then they uncovered messages suggesting she had been offering explicit services for money. This wasn't directly related to the crash, but it mattered. It showed deception, it showed compartmentalization, and it showed a willingness to live a double life without concern for consequences. Then came the discovery that changed everything. Using phone location data, investigators mapped Mackenzie's movements in the days before the crash. They expected to find normal teenage routines. What they found instead was chilling. Mackenzie had driven down Progress Drive multiple times, 7 times, always towards the same wall. She wasn't lost. She wasn't unfamiliar with the road. She had rehearsed it. Each drive followed the same path, the same approach, the same endpoint. This single discovery transformed suspicion into certainty. The crash was not spontaneous. It was planned. More interviews followed. Dominic's brother told detectives something critical. Days before the crash, Dominic had been afraid. Not anxious, afraid. He described an incident where Mackenzie hit Dominic while driving on the highway. Dominic had pulled over and called someone else to take them home because she feared she would cause a crash. This was not speculation. This was history repeating itself. The difference was that this time there was no one to stop it. Investigators also looked closely at Mackenzie's behavior after the incident. She mourned publicly in some ways, posting memorials, wearing Dominic's clothes, building what appeared to be a shrine. At the same time, she partied, she bragged, she acted untouched by the weight of what had happened. To detectives, this duality mattered. It suggested emotional manipulation rather than grief. By early November, investigators believed they had enough. On November 4, 2022, officers arrived to arrest Mackenzie Shirilla. She was 18 years old. She was charged with 2 counts of aggravated murder. Her parents arrived shortly after, shocked, furious, desperate. They argued the arrest was unfair, that their daughter was fragile, that she was still recovering. The warrant stood. The decision had been made. At the station, Mackenzie said very little. Her parents demanded attorneys. They insisted she not speak. Investigators didn't need a confession. They already had the data. As the case moved toward trial, the narrative hardened. This was no longer about drugs, no longer about a medical episode, no longer about reckless youth. It was about intent. Prosecutors would argue that Mackenzie made a decision long before that morning, that she saw death as a solution to a relationship she could not control, and that when she chose to act, she did so methodically. The community watched in disbelief. Some still believed it was an accident. Others believed the evidence spoke for itself. Dominic and Davion could not speak. The road they died on was silent. The wall still stood. When the case finally reached the courtroom, it carried the weight of months of speculation, outrage, and unanswered questions. Mackenzie Shirilla elected to waive her right to a jury trial. Instead, she placed her fate in the hands of a single judge. That decision alone changed the tone of everything that followed. There would be no emotional jury reactions to sway, no room for theatrical persuasion, only evidence, timelines, data, intent. The prosecution's objective was clear. They did not need to prove recklessness. They needed to prove purpose. And they believed they could. Prosecutors laid out their case methodically. They argued that this was not a spontaneous act fueled by drugs or panic. It was a calculated decision, formed over days, reinforced by threats, and rehearsed through repeated drives down Progress Drive. They pointed to the speed data, the absence of braking, the sharp maneuver to avoid the tree. the seatbelt worn only by the driver. Each detail, they said, pointed to awareness, to control, to choice. The prosecution emphasized that Mackenzie did not black out. She did not drift. She accelerated deliberately. One piece of evidence stood above the rest. Known as Exhibit 802, it consisted of synchronized data showing speed, location, and timing in the final moments before impact. As the judge reviewed the material, prosecutors described it in stark terms. They said it was impossible to watch without understanding what was coming. The vehicle reached extreme speed. It stayed there. It did not slow. To the prosecution, this data crystallized everything. This was not reckless driving. This was execution of a decision. The defense focused on one central claim: loss of consciousness. They argued that Mackenzie's medical condition combined with substances caused her to faint behind the wheel, that she was not aware of what she was doing, that the crash was tragic but not intentional. They pointed to her injuries, her recovery, her youth. They argued that no one would deliberately choose such a violent outcome. But the prosecution countered that argument relentlessly. Loss of consciousness does not involve steering. Loss of consciousness does not involve avoiding obstacles. Loss of consciousness does not involve rehearsing a route. Witnesses described Mackenzie's behavior before the crash: threats when Dominic tried to leave, fear he expressed to family, warnings he gave to friends. The court heard that Dominic had been afraid she would crash a car. The defense struggled to explain how those fears aligned with an accident. This was not a fast decision. The judge reviewed testimony, data, and arguments carefully. When the ruling came, it was detailed and unequivocal. The court found that Mackenzie's actions were controlled, deliberate, purposeful. The judge stated that the evidence showed a clear transformation from a responsible driver to someone who intentionally accelerated towards death. The ruling emphasized that this was not a momentary lapse, it was sustained conduct. On August 14, 2023, the verdict was delivered. Guilty. Multiple counts, including murder. The court rejected the defense's explanation entirely. The crash was ruled intentional. The deaths of Dominic Russo and Davion were not accidents. They were the result of a conscious choice. Mackenzie Shirilla was sentenced to 15 years to life. Her earliest opportunity for parole will come in 2037. As the sentence was read, there were no outbursts, no dramatic reactions, just finality. For Dominic and Davion's families, there was no relief, only closure of a different kind. Even after the verdict, debate did not stop. Some still argued that Mackenzie was mentally unwell, that the justice system failed to account for her age, that this was punishment without compassion. Others argued the opposite, that this case demonstrated how controlling emotion, obsession, and entitlement can escalate into irreversible harm, that accountability mattered, that intent mattered. Progress Drive remains unchanged, a short road, a dead end, a wall. To most people, it is unremarkable, but for those who know the case, it represents something else. A place where warning signs were ignored, a place where intent met opportunity, a place where two lives ended because one person decided they would not be left behind. This case forces uncomfortable questions. How often do threats get dismissed as drama? How often does controlling behavior go unnoticed? How often do people assume tragedy must be accidental because the alternative is too disturbing to consider? The Mackenzie Shirilla case is not just about a crash. It's about warning signs, patterns, and the cost of ignoring them. Mackenzie Shirilla now lives behind bars. Dominic Russo and Davion do not. Their families live with absence, with memory, with a road that never truly ends. When cases like this end, there's a temptation to look for clean conclusions, a verdict, a sentence, a sense that justice, once spoken aloud in a courtroom, somehow restores balance. But real life doesn't work that way. 2 young people are still gone. Their futures did not pause. They did not reset. They simply ended at the end of a short road that offered no escape, no second chance, no time to reconsider what had already been decided. And one person remains alive, carrying the weight of a choice that cannot be undone. The Mackenzie Shirilla case is uncomfortable not because of what happened in the final seconds, but because of everything that came before. The warnings, the threats spoken and dismissed, the fear expressed quietly and not acted upon, the behaviors that in hindsight form a clear pattern, but in the moment were treated as drama, youth, or volatility that would eventually pass. This story reminds us that violence does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrives disguised as emotion, as control mistaken for love, as desperation mistaken for vulnerability. By the time it reveals its true shape, it is already too late to intervene. Progress Drive still exists. Cars still turn onto it every day. Most drivers reach the end and turn around without a second thought. The wall stands unchanged, solid, silent, indifferent. It does not remember what happened there. People do. For the families left behind, time did not heal the loss. It simply taught them how to carry it. For the community, the case left a fracture between those who believe this was preventable and those who still struggle to accept that intent can exist in places we least expect it. And for anyone watching, listening, or learning about this story long after the headlines faded, the lesson is not about fear. It's about attention. Listening when someone says they are afraid, taking threats seriously even when they sound emotional, recognizing that control is not love and obsession is not devotion. Because the most dangerous moments are often not impulsive. They're rehearsed quietly, repeatedly, until opportunity and intent finally meet. The court has spoken. The sentence has been handed down. The case is closed on paper, but the questions it raises remain open, and perhaps they always should.